Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is my distinct honor and privilege to be introducing Professor Ashok Gadgil. And this is at a time when I think extreme temperature increases outside of natural climate variation have become our new normal. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Ashok Gadgil when I was at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He has been my mentor, and I have always looked up to him for, I think, career advice and for finding out, I think, what is he working on at this time. So let me introduce Professor Gadgil, even though I think for people in the field of energy and environment, I think he doesn't need much introduction. Ashok Gadgil is a distinguished professor of the graduate school, the distinguished professor emeritus of safe water and sanitation in civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, and was a faculty senior scientist and division director in the energy technologies area of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. His research has led to several patents and inventions and more than 150 scientific peer-reviewed journal publications. A substantial amount of his research aims for technology-based scalable solutions to problems of clean energy, safe drinking water in resource-poor communities and countries. Dr. Gadgil is a recipient of numerous awards and honors for his extensive work, including the Heinz Award, the Zayed Sustainability Prize, the Lemelson MIT Global Innovator Award, induction in the National Inventors Hall of Fame, election to the National Academies of Engineering and the National Academy of Inventors, and above all, in 2023, he received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. The latter is the highest national honor bestowed by the President of the United States on the country's topmost technology inventors and innovators. So without further ado, I invite Professor Gadgil to share his thoughts on thermal stress and extreme heat that we are facing all around the world, and which is an area of particular concern for India and for the India Cooling Coalition that is hosting this luminary talk from Professor Gadgil. Over to you, Dr. Gadgil.
Thank you so much, Satish. It's my great pleasure to be invited to give this talk. My talk is going to be quite short because I would like to treat this more as a dialogue than as a talk. It's not like I know something that is a mature piece of research to simply convey to you. It is more like current research, what me and my students are working on, why we think it is important, what we can do about it, and why it is really, really urgent for people interested in the future of low latitude countries, particularly technical people, people with engineering science knowledge, why it's really, really important for us to pay attention to what is happening to extreme heat stress and what could be done about it to survive. So without taking too much more time, I would like to start sharing my slides. I promised to, or I plan to speak for only 15 minutes with discussion, fireside chat with Dr. Satish, and then open it up for your comments, your questions, and your suggestions. So I treat this more as a collaborative exploration of this really difficult and important topic. Let me start with the slide share. here, start sharing, and go to full screen. Okay. Can you see my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay. So global burden of mortality with extreme heat has increased up, and up as the planet has warmed. Heat-related deaths have gone up. Number of outdoor workers exposed to extreme heat has gone up. The statistics are not particularly reassuring, given that 2023 broke all records, and again 2024 broke all records. And we have scientists, climate scientists, saying we don't know why it's getting so much hotter than our climate models. You've probably seen those opinions and editorials that the planet for the last 2 years, 23 and now 24, is significantly hotter than predicted by all the models. So there is something else happening that we don't know, or we didn't plan for, we did not incorporate in our models. But the focus of this talk is not about climate modeling. The focus of the talk is about what to do with what's going to happen. In terms of excess deaths, this is looking back in 2000 to 2019. So these are 20 years, these are 20 years of temperature and death records. So Zhao et al. In the Lancet estimate that total deaths in South Asia, over here, I hope you can see my cursor, right? Total deaths in South Asia accounted for 111,000 annually from heat. And this is a peer-reviewed standard paper. Most of these deaths would be in India, of course. And independently, we estimated, my colleagues and I at Berkeley, what are the excess deaths in India per single heat wave. And our estimate is between 30,000 to 50,000 for a single heat wave. And given that typically India experiences between 4 and 6 heat waves every summer, our numbers come up approximately with the numbers that Zhao et al. Have come up here. This slide simply shows what the past climate was like, the gray curve, and what the warmer climate is going to be like, which has a higher mean. So the curve has shifted to the right. And it has also a larger variance. So the standard deviation has increased, which means that if this yellow zone was a past climate in terms of extreme heat days, there'll be more such days in the future, but there also will be hotter extreme heat days in the future. So this is what we are looking at now, this yellow triangular space. But what we should be preparing for is handling this much larger chunk of area shaded red and dark red. There is a very nice paper by Xu et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2020, which looks at what's the human climate niche, what is the area, what are the climate zones where human beings can survive. And some of the conclusions they come up with is between 1 and 3.5 billion people will be displaced by 2070. due to extreme heat. So let me show you a little bit more detail. This map is from their figure. The completely black areas on the map are currently uninhabitable from extreme summer temperatures. But the hatched areas that go all the way from Mexico, Latin America, big chunk of Africa, Saudi Arabia, and big chunk of India, all the way across Australia and so on, all of this would become uninhabitable if business as usual climate scenario progresses to 2070. And in absence of migration, this area will be home to what 3.5 billion people. So pretty catastrophic consequences are heading to low latitude regions of the world if business as usual continues. And so far as we can tell, business as usual has indeed continued in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases from all countries. So low latitude regions face the greatest threat and contribute the least to climate change. The text is here for you to read. It does not look good. So heat stress occurs when body cannot get rid of heat. The key point here is heat index or heat stress occurs because the core temperature of the human body needs to be maintained at 37 degrees Celsius plus minus 0.5. We are exothermic animals. We must reject heat all the time. If we cannot reject heat, our core temperature begins to rise. As the core temperature begins to rise, heart rates go up, leading eventually to heat sickness. And if there is no relief, it leads to death. In the past, a postulated hypothetical survivability limit was postulated to be a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius. All this is outdoor temperature, okay? I'm only worrying about outdoor temperature, not office space that is air conditioned. I'll come to that in a second. Recent empirical and theoretical studies show that critical temperature, that is the maximum temperature above which core temperature begins to rise in an unstoppable way, is as low as 32 degrees wet bulb. And here is a citation so that you can look it up. Make sure I'm not missing a slide. Good. So this heat index is not, people talk about heat index as if it is like feels like temperature, but it's nothing about a psychological feeling alone. It is the physiological difficulty of expelling heat to keep the core temperature at within the bounds of 37 Celsius plus minus 0.5 Celsius. A scientist at a National Weather Service called Steadman, 1979, citation is in the box below, explains how he developed the heat index. The heat index is the equivalent external temperature under a nominal parametric conditions of metabolic effort or METs, under a nominal wind speed, under a nominal vapor pressure of water vapor, that provides the same physiological difficulty for cooling as experience at any combination, a given combination of temperature and humidity. So he has a model of thermal regulation, and that has remained unchanged from 1979. A number of people have developed algebraic fits or algebraic expressions to fit the heat index, and subsequent work by Fanger and others in indoor air comfort has gone on to develop other ways to measure the predicted mean vote of thermal comfort and many other ways in which we can manage to see what should be the indoor temperature like. So this heat index has remained unchanged. It has become the most popular around the world. This National Weather Service heat index, however, underestimates the heat stress at the upper end of its range in extreme heat events. So to repair that shortcoming, Roms and Liu developed something called an extended heat index. And here is a citation. And we are paying more attention to the 92% of Indians who don't have access to air conditioning and 50% of Indian workforce that labors outdoors with much harsher metabolic heat generation than people who are sitting in office chairs. So we need to help them to survive the heat. And this heat index addresses issues when the temperature and humidity are so high that sweat drips off the skin rather than all getting evaporated. Oops. So the extension estimates physiological response, allows sweat to drip off, allows accumulation by the body through accommodation by the body via vasodilation and reduction in metabolic rate by reducing muscular effort, drinking cold water, using a cooling system, whatever you could do to keep the body from having heat illness. So using conditions in July 95 and July 2011, the standard heat index for the two top heat waves is shown using the extended heat index map. This is United States. This is the same showing National Weather Service calculation. This is showing the error. The error was 10 degrees Celsius in mid-latitudes in the United States in the heat wave. My students applied the same methodology to India for Indian heat waves in 2015, in May of 2015. And these are the maps for India for May 24, 2015, where we demonstrate that the standard NWS heat index underestimates the heat stress by 18 degrees Celsius in these two regions. And this hotspot, by the way, is a place in Rourkela, near Rourkela. So maximum value there of EHI is 66 degrees Celsius. This map is a difference between this map minus that map so that you actually get negative values, but that's because that's the error in the heat index. Okay, so this error up here in the worst places is 18 degrees Celsius, underestimate of how difficult it is for people working outdoors or just being outdoors. Now, even the extended heat index does not model heat stress for those who have a higher metabolic load because they are working hard, or people who are not in the shade. So EHI is only for somebody who is in the shade, no sunlight. And EHI is also for somebody with very light labor, equivalent to just walking in the shade with adequate cold water, being in young adult excellent health. So if one is elderly or an adolescent or children, they're more vulnerable than what the EHI talks about. If people have other problems like kidney problems, heart problems, diabetes, uh, they are more vulnerable. So my group is working to make modifications to EHI to calculate the equivalent heat stress for those who are actually out in the sun or who are out laboring in the sun, maybe construction workers, agricultural workers, people doing bicycle rickshaws, people pushing carts, and so on. And also people who are not in optimum health of being a young adult in great health. So what are some of the possible actions? First of all, we need to figure out that we need to publicize, implement and publicize an improved extended heat index, and what should be the limits for those who are laboring individuals, those who are outdoors in sunlight, and for vulnerable segments of population. Policies to protect outdoor workers. We know for a fact from examples elsewhere, for example, in Florida and Singapore, that breaks in the work to allow for rest in the shade with rehydration and access to cold water or ice slurry drinking just water, as Singapore is experimenting since 2022, provides relief. And we need to bring that to be the norm for 92% of Indians who don't have access to air conditioning. We need to think about and implement activities for cooling shelters so that they can go to rest in the shade with a lower heat index than what they're experiencing outside. Same thing goes for exterior insulation on existing solid concrete 4-inch thin uninsulated buildings, and experiment with to promote urban designs that shade entire streets, as the Rockefeller Foundation funded and demonstrated in Sierra Leone, so that street vendors and people who actually work outdoors in the urban setting would have shaded streets which are cooler and don't have the extra heat load of working in the sun. That's the end of my 15 minutes. And I want to stop sharing. I have many more slides, but that's not the point here. I want to stop sharing and listen to you and have a dialogue. Over to you, Satish.
So thank you so much, Ashok, for I think making us aware and educating us a little bit about what this extremely high temperature means for people who are exposed to these kind of temperatures outdoors, and also letting us know that it's both the extreme heat temperature, extremely high temperature, coupled with the high humidity that is the killer. And that's why the concept of wet bulb temperature becomes so critical. And I think to your point that maybe 35 degrees Celsius of wet bulb temperature is a bit too high, because I think if we have been hearing and seeing in literature and with some experiments that even exposure of like about half an hour at 32 to 33 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature can prove deadly for most of the people, and definitely for vulnerable people. I just wanted to expand the conversation, Ashok, if you will allow me. and provide a little bit of context because this lecture is being hosted by India Cooling Coalition. And there are all the leading organizations in India who are working on thermal comfort and cooling are members of this coalition. And we are all working towards implementation of India Cooling Action Plan, which was launched by Government of India more than 5 years ago, and which kind of not just nationally, but internationally started to draw the attention of policymakers, companies, financiers on this problem of extreme heat, but more in the sense of like thermal comfort inside the buildings. So I just want to give some examples and some quotes. Like India, as you mentioned in some of the charts that you showed, is extremely vulnerable. And I use like one metric, which is a combination of the population plus the cooling degree days. So if you look at India, it's about 4.2 trillion person cooling degree days. Okay, this is the inherent cooling requirement that I think India has. As opposed to this, if you look at China, then China is about 50% of this, about 2.1 trillion person cooling degree days, because its temperature, average temperature over the country is not as high as India. And if you look at US is about 1/8 of this number because it has 350 million people, and the cooling degree day is also proportionately lower. So I think just to highlight that what India is facing, what India is staring at, and why is this such a critical factor, both from an outdoor heat mitigation as well as providing people with indoor thermally comfortable environment. Uh, uh, India Cooling Action Plan, Ashok, was one of the first major policy document which moved away from this narrative of cooling for all to thermal comfort for all, because cooling is out of reach for many people, not just in India, but around the world. And I think the cooling for all is a Western narrative, in our opinion, that I think it presupposes that people will have access to active air conditioning, which is not necessarily the case. So I think I just want to come back to one point. I think while we understand that heat stress is going to affect people working outdoors as well as indoor, what do you see as a more pressing issue? I mean, should we, or should a country like India or other global South countries, should they be focusing more on, I think, mitigating heat, providing design solutions, some of which you alluded to in your lecture as well? Or I think we should also be looking at providing indoor thermal comfort, which also affects human productivity and other things. Or should we adopt a hybrid approach?
I first of all, thank you very much. I'm in full agreement with the points you made in terms of the diversity of the very large diversity of India's problems relating to heat. We have people who are really living on the streets at one end, and we have people who practically never have to experience outdoor extreme heat because they are 24/7 in air-conditioned environments at the other end. So we don't have one solution that fits all, but a vast majority of Indians don't have access to air conditioning. Therefore, cooling for all is not the right way to go. You're perfectly spot on in saying thermal comfort for all is the right way to go, because that's what 92% of the Indians have to experience, is figure out how to survive, how to not have heat illness, or how not to lose their family members or themselves in extreme heat exposure. So the challenge is, how are we going to offer solutions for the 92% of the people who are not going to have air conditioning. And the obvious answers have to be both personal cooling, have to be provision of ice slurry, for example, something that Singapore can experiment with already and Florida experiments with. But in India, you can't buy an ice slurry machine because nobody makes ice slurry machines like we make refrigerators. Even though ice slurry machines are going to be a direct cooler of the core temperature when you drink the ice slurry, and in Singapore they give only between 200 to 400 milliliters of ice slurry to cool the core of outdoor workers, which is far more direct than having an external battery operated fan, for example, on your skin, right? But these are effective solutions, as are solutions for different degrees of keeping the building surfaces cooler, either through insulation or through cool roof projects of various kinds to prevent direct sunlight from blasting onto the roof, for example. Either you have a reflective roof or you have a canopy double roof or whatever you do, right? All of these is in other words, there is no single silver bullet. All of the above is the right way to go. But that all of the above list needs to be extended, and we need to be open to see what other countries and other cities are doing, and we need to be experimenting and not be afraid to fail, because when we experiment, our learning mindset allows us to pick up what succeeds and develop it further and figure out what is failing and try to understand what is the engineering science of why it fails. So we need a lot more attention and activity directed towards figuring out what is going to work.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did I answer your question? In
Yeah.
many ways, the ball is in our court. The industrial countries are not gonna give us these solutions.
Right. So Ashok, I think you make a very interesting point, and I just want to allude to some of the work. I mean, of course, I think climate change is staring us in our face, and I think while we are continuing to work on mitigation, but it's becoming obvious that I think adaptation and resilience are going to become very, very important. And the point
urgent, and they're much more urgent.
right. Because I think they will save lives. I think otherwise, I think
Yeah.
we
Sure.
can be in deep trouble. So I think just building on what you mentioned about ice slurries, I was at CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and I think they are looking at. I think you mentioned agricultural workers and construction workers, and they are also, I think, of course, some of this information is being used by many of the policy makers. So they are thinking of coming out with design of urban canopies, which will provide shade for some of these people, or rural canopies. I think if you are working in agricultural heartland of India, and then figuring out ways that how can you provide water and ice or ice slurry there. Because if someone gets a heat stroke, that's probably the most important thing that one can do to save life. And
very true.
Infrastructure wise, I think what they were saying that we are going to struggle for some time, because as you mentioned, that ice is not that easily accessible to different parts, and definitely not in rural areas. But there are efforts. I just wanted to highlight that there is some thinking that is going on to address, I think, this urgent problem on how to address,
sure,
I think, external heat stress.
Sure. I mean, my argument, you're spot on. I fully support the idea that we need to figure out how to rapidly make ice slurry available wherever needed, with maybe a photovoltaic panel and a small 100-watt refrigeration. This is just vapor compression, okay? Nothing fancy. You don't need solid state refrigeration, just standard vapor compression machines at low end of the range, which are now very mature and very efficient, if you do not try to turn this into a refrigerator, but directly use the coils to make an ice slurry in an insulated pot, which is scraped continuously. That's how you make slurry rather than have solid pieces of ice grow. That way, you have a way to directly cool the core of anybody who is experiencing even heat illness or heat stroke, because the ice slurry is, if the person is conscious, he or she is able to actually drink it and cool the core right away. The troubling part is by the time the person passes out, it is extremely dangerous to give them even water to drink, because medical science says that often it goes into the lungs. If a person has lost consciousness, it is so difficult to cool the core, because then the ability to swallow has disappeared, and you are very likely to start putting water into the wrong place in the lungs, which will lead to all kinds of complications we don't want. So, in many ways, you got to intervene before the person passes out. And this is a primary healthcare unit everywhere, which has ordinary medicine, should have an ice slurry machine. And it's not rocket science. India can build them by the hundreds of thousands per year, no question.
So, Ashok, I have probably one or two short questions before we open up, but I do want to uh, uh, inform you that you are aware of Solar Decathlon, which is
Sure,
part of
yes.
US
Right, right,
Department
right.
of Energy, and that has been picked up in India by AEEE and IIHS. And
Right,
your friend Prasad Vaidya is the director of the Solar Decathlon India program and doing a
right,
wonderful job there. And I think in Solar Decathlon India, one of the building typologies in fact, two building typologies. One is a construction worker housing, because these people live in very, very lousy, I think,
true.
temporary shelters. And
Right,
then there's another one, which is how to design a resilient shelter, which can house like hundreds or thousands of people, I think, at a time of heat stress. And
right.
I think at least in these areas, or as a community sort of like service, some of the things that I think we are discussing is going to become very, very important, I think, in terms of, because people will be stressed, I think, when they are working outside. So that's, I just wanted to talk
Absolutely. Oh,
about
no,
that.
no, you're totally right. It'll be life saving to do that. And recently, I've been in touch with Prasad. We have had a project already started on designing cooling shelters using structural insulating panels, SIPs. In India, Infosys has already experimented with SIPs, but I don't know anybody else who has done SIPs using expanded polystyrene foam. There is a company in India that does it with polyurethane foam, but polyurethane is troubling because if it catches fire, it produces hydrogen cyanide. So we would rather stay with cheaper and safer alternative. We have built those back a few years ago and tested them for fire safety in Houston, but we now need to do the whole thing in India.
So that's very interesting, because that was my next question, Ashok. And this is related to technology and innovation. And someone, I think, who has worked at the intersection of, I think, water, energy, and now thermal comfort, and addressing heat stress. I think there is probably not a better person than you to answer this question. So I want to come back to the building envelope issue. India has good policies in the form of building energy codes. However, I think the passive building design and focusing on designing the right envelope, I think that art seems to have been lost in India. Okay, and what we are seeing is that even meeting the bare minimum building energy code, like for residential, it's RETV of 15 or 12, is extremely hard to do, I think, given, again, the tropical nature of our climate. And because insulation is still not very widely used in typical construction, and sometimes people want to maximize the real estate area, so they are going for thinner and concrete walls rather than these structured insulation panels, which I think is something that, in my opinion, is a good option. But because of, I think, it's not widely produced, it's not cost effectively available to developers. And as you mentioned, that Infosys and very few companies have been able to use it. How do you see, I think, how India should focus on maybe providing significant incentives for developing some of these technologies that are going to address the thermal comfort as well as mitigation of the heat stress problem? Because I sometimes feel that, I think, while we are doing good on renewable energy, we are not truly understanding the scale of the problem that the country is facing. And I think if we have to build a resilient sort of like building and construction ecosystem, then what would be your advice, I think, in terms of how to go about encouraging the innovation culture in India, which is so badly needed, I think, when it comes to building envelope technologies?
You're absolutely right that if we don't touch buildings, we will never be able to handle the issue of survival in the heat. Okay, so buildings, either via retrofit insulations like we managed to do in Russia when Soviet Union broke apart and they went to a market-based economy, the cost of fuel for heating buildings and cost of electricity went through the roof. During the Soviet era, buildings in Russia, very cold, used to be overheated. And the only way people used to regulate indoor temperature was by opening windows. And then came the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then came a 5-fold or 6-fold rise in fuel costs. And suddenly they couldn't afford to heat their buildings even with the windows tightly shut because the buildings were completely uninsulated. So NRDC, in fact, San Francisco, my friend David Goldstein, flew to Russia many times to demonstrate and explain to them how you insulate buildings from the outside, on the building exterior, because you don't want to break the building down and you don't want to take the indoor space. So you have to allow for the building to have 4-inch or 8-inch insulation on the outside by bolting it onto the building. And NRDC actually did that with the Russian buildings. I think we have to do something similar here because we have so many housing projects already in place that having something done on the indoor and leaving it to the occupants is going to be a financial challenge for the occupants as well, and going to be much harder. Whereas exterior insulation can be done for the whole building all at once, so long as you have a flat surface on which to add the exterior insulation with an additional exterior layer, of course. So that, and there needs to be policy support, there needs to be government support and support from the courts, because people's lives are going to depend on this. It's pretty much like we say, everybody's got to get safe drinking water, and eventually we have delivered safe drinking water, at least to our urban inhabitants, more or less, much better than what used to be the case, right? So same thing is going to be there. It's a combined effort between industry and the government policymakers and the non-profit experts, either at universities or in non-profits, that will actually allow us to survive. It is a life and death question, really. And it's coming upon us faster than the press is willing to acknowledge.
Thank you, Ashok. I have a list of long questions, but I'll keep it aside in the interest of, I think, the other audience members, and they don't get this opportunity to interact with you often. So I'm going to hand it over to Supriya, perhaps, to see, I think, what kind of questions we want to get and direct at Ashok to learn further from his wisdom. Over to you, Supriya.
Thank you, Professor Ashok. Thank you, Dr. Krishna. That was a very interesting conversation. Now to take questions. We have a group of people here at the India Cooling Coalition kickoff meeting. We have people joining us together from the AEEE office, and a lot of our members and partners are joining online. If you have a question, raise your hand so that we can take the question. And once we take your name, then you please unmute.
Akash.
Yes, we have a question here from Akash. Yes.
So should I just?
It's fine.
Okay, all right. Hi, this is Akash Goenka, and it's a privilege to hear you and Satish discuss this very pressing challenge. I've been listening to the both of you with rapt attention. My question to you, sir, is that how is the medical community reacting to the imminent heat challenge, and how are some of the top medical bodies, say for instance the CDC or the ICMR in India, reacting to this, and what could their role possibly be in elevating this problem to the highest political level?
It's a very important and very good question. I've been following the literature only in the international journals, and there is a huge amount of literature coming out with experimental data on what is happening with hyperthermia. What does hyperthermia do to blood flow, heart blood flow? For example, I recently learned a major meta study that every 1 degree Celsius temperature, ambient temperature rise leads to 4% increase in infant mortality at birth within the first 28 days. It also leads to higher mortality for the young, not just the infant, but for the mother as well. And during heat waves, the proportion of premature babies increases by a very large fraction. All of this is coming out in Nature. Both Lancet and Nature have a whole lot of papers on heat adaptation or lack of adaptation, heat effects, in terms of survival, in terms of how, for example, workers under hyperthermia make much more riskier decisions, and therefore are much more likely to have construction accidents than the same workers working in moderate temperatures. So there are psychological effects, there are survival effects on infants, there are premature birth effects, there are premature birth leading to diabetes in later life at an early age. All of these consequential damages are also being recorded now in the international medical literature. But the overall societal discussion in India of how we need to be proactive to deal with heat stress that is coming our way is almost missing. There are few enlightened people like the India Cooling Coalition, obviously. But overall, the sense of urgency and the sense of foreboding, I have to say I have, seems to be not reflected in the public dialogue. So I think all of us have to raise our voice saying, this is really a big threat with unprecedented exposure, and we need to take action. And nobody's going to tell us what will work and what won't, because the first world countries don't have to face this music. We have to deal with it. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Yeah, Dr.
Hello, good morning here and good evening there, Dr. Gadgil, Bhaskar Natarajan.
Hey,
AEEE.
Bhaskar.
Hey, hi, how are you? Long time. I've
Good.
been following all the work that you've been doing. Two questions. One is more of a comment and a status in the United States. Half a dozen states in India have issued heat stress as a state disaster, officially recognizing it. And while the implementation of that may be left to challenges, but at least it has been recognized.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know which states in the US or any national body has issued any such notification. First question. The second question, you mentioned about Lancet, Nature, and others publishing plenty of studies highlighting the deaths and mortalities and so on. In the US itself, have these studies been taken note of and any policy guidelines notifications issued?
Let me answer them in sequence. Almost all states have issued, even at the county level, heat warnings. I get them on my phone here in California. When the temperatures are going to be high and we need to make sure that we remain hydrated and we remain in the shade and we monitor that we don't get exposed to high heat stress. So these heat warnings are now transmitted through emergency broadcast agencies as text messages to all the cell phones of all the people who signed up for them. And most of us have signed up as a way to learn when there is a likelihood of a flash flood or likelihood of a massive tsunami or hurricane, or more likely extreme heat wave coming. So at least on the text, we get these warnings. In some states which have been politically conservative, like Florida, they have banned providing relief to outdoor workers doing outdoor labor, giving them breaks. But most states have allowed this, and some have actually encouraged it, but not yet enforced it. The agency that does worker risk assessment and worker risk management is OSHA, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They still have not yet implemented the advanced metric for heat stress in the United States. Doesn't matter that much here because most of Americans are indoors most of the time. 95% of the time, an average American is indoor somewhere, in the car, in a shopping mall, at home, or at work. That's not the case in India, and which are far more exposed to heat than they are here, but they still are. So the state record varies a lot, and the agencies at least issue warnings, but we haven't got a uniform aggressive response to heat stress yet, primarily because air conditioning is so prevalent wherever needed.
Thank you, Professor Ashok. Any more questions from the participants? Okay, so I have a question. If we have to talk about this 92% of the population who does not have access to air conditioning, in such a scenario, do you think passive cooling technologies or the traditional solutions that India had will work?
Of course, the passive technologies will work in the sense that traditionally, if you had some desert coolers or evaporative coolers, and if you had deep overhangs so that you had verandas around the house so that the walls were always shaded from direct sunlight, all of those, in principle, the physics of it will work. But we are no longer in India of 200 years ago, where you had thick adobe or mud walls, or we had thatched roofs, or we had deep verandas. Now we live in thin concrete walled buildings, blazingly beaten by the afternoon sun, with high temperature outside, and in some parts of India with high humidity too. So we need to find out what old techniques work and whether they are practical or not, and whether they are effective in the new conditions of high density urban cities, high density housing, with just oven-like outdoor temperatures. So in other words, my take is it's not a yes or no, but it's a very guarded yes, saying sure, if you are lucky enough to be living in a large space where you could have old deep veranda techniques, they would work there, but most of us don't have that luxury. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Participants are joining us online. Do you have any questions?
Supriya,
Yes.
if there is none, then I would like to ask one more question. But
Yes.
if there is anyone in the audience who want to ask, then I'll like them to ask first.
I think Pratima has.
Yeah, Pratima.
Thank you, Professor, for the insightful lecture. I just had a question which is related somewhat to the previous ones. What's, in your view, the latest research suggesting on prolonged exposure to more lower level heat? So, for instance, yes, we have workers who work outside for a number of hours, people who are living in homes that are less thermally comfortable. But often they're working outside and coming back to these homes and they're elevated nighttime temperatures because of a number of reasons in our cities, lack of ventilation in these dense urban environments. And that prolonged exposure might continue for days. And sometimes those health impacts may get overlooked. And also, when we, as sustainability professionals working in this area, try to make a case that this is equally important than just counting the number of deaths during a heat wave, that economic benefit of avoided health costs is very difficult to quantify. So if you've got any pointers you could share on that, that would be very helpful.
Sure. The international literature coming out of even India already documents that when the outdoor temperatures are high, Indian outdoor workers have to reduce their muscular effort. They have to reduce their metabolic heat generation to keep themselves from having heat stroke. So, for example, construction workers are observed and documented to walk more slowly during the summertime when they are carrying bricks on their head in the heat, compared to the same workers working in a cooler season. So your economic productivity obviously has gone down as a result, because higher metabolic internal heat generation, you can't get rid of the heat. One of the automatic reactions is to reduce muscular effort in every which possible way. And that means lower productivity, and everybody is therefore lower economic output. you are entirely correct that counting the number of deaths is a relatively easier thing, but it underestimates the 10 times more people who are injured, some of them permanently, for example, with progressive kidney dysfunction. So the chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology, CKDU as it is called, which is now observed across up and down on the east coast of India and in Sri Lanka, where every summer kidney function deteriorates, never to recover, but every summer it drops lower and lower and lower until the person reaches a point where dialysis is needed and leads to a painful death in absence of a kidney transplant. Those kind of people don't get counted in heat stroke deaths. Even our heat stroke deaths are often misclassified as just a heart attack, died of cardiac failure. But we know that the amount of blood that the heart has to pump must double when the core temperature goes from 36.5 Celsius to 37, from 37 to 39 Celsius. That 2.5 degrees Celsius increase in the core temperature leads to doubling of the blood output rate by the heart. So somebody with a weak heart is going to have a heart attack and collapse. But we don't record that as a heat death. We record it as a heat stroke. Sorry, record it as a heart stroke. So there is a whole lot of misunderstanding in counting heat deaths. And there's a whole lot of miscounting of heat illness and long-term heat damage to our health. You're entirely right. Heat, fortunately, the death is a 0 or 1 kind of thing, very clear. Person is alive or not. So it's a very simple thing, but it gets misclassified. Whereas heat illness is also misclassified. Nobody knew for the longest time why CKDU was showing up along coastal Andhra Pradesh and Odisha and in Sri Lanka. Until that etiology is becoming now clear. But there is a lot of research that remains to be done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Arjun Gupta?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Gadgil. Hope you're good.
Hey, good to see you,
Nice
Arjun.
to
How
see
are
you.
you?
Very good. Thank you. One of the best things I've loved about your work is that you are always looking at commercialization and vast deployment in addition to just developing technology, right? So I would love to learn in this area of cooling and thermal stress that you've spoken about, especially for the vulnerable populations. Are there any business model innovations your labs and teams are working on? Are there any commercializable products or solutions that you are building, and what is your thought on actually deployment, and in respect to that, are there any collaboration opportunities for people like me?
Oh, sure. At least 2 of them come right off the top, maybe 3. One is we have to make structural insulating panels in India, because that's a way to very rapidly build insulated homes, insulated shelters, insulated cooling spots, even for construction workers or not. And it's an industrially made building, so you don't need a very skilled workforce then to assemble it. So it's a lot of prefab work that goes there, but it's good. So there is one. The second one is that we really need in India somebody to start supplying all over India ice slurry machines, which is pretty straightforward technology because you need a vapor compression engine to driven with maybe photovoltaic, and then make ice slurry, and that is a well understood technology, but nobody kind of can buy it off the shelf today in India. Not that I know of, but that needs to become commonplace, because the best way to cool the core, which is what kills, is to get the person iced slurry to drink. The third one is to actually have, and this is much more ambitious, is to actually think about a service that will broadcast equivalent heat stress, extended heat stress index based on your location to your cell phone. So you know to get the hell out of that outdoor oven, because it's going to damage your health permanently if you stay there too long. And sometimes what happens is psychologically you override the heat stress and say, oh, I can bear it. I can have an umbrella. I can wear a cap. I'm a strong man. I can survive just fine. But actually that's not the case. All of us will get damaged if the core temperature goes higher and higher, above 39. So having a warning, having something that actually calculates and transmits that single number, pretty much like any other weather channel will do for your cell phone. That should be an amazing thing to have handy for everybody. It's ambitious, but it has a very large potential impact. There must be lots of other ideas. I'm just throwing you on the top of my head.
Good morning, Mr. Gadgil. This is Praveen here. So we are a company that's into phase change materials, thermal energy storage, and we do a lot of solar plus PCM units for cooling of cold rooms that are completely off-grid.
Wonderful.
So I think that there's a lot of applicational fit here. We also recently innovated where we have a plus 22 to 25 degree PCM that is very, very good at, because of to prevent thermal
off-peak,
shock.
that's great. So you can do off-peak cooling and avoid the peak load problem that the grid will face.
Absolutely. So
oh,
not
sure.
only that,
It's a fantastic thing. Yeah.
We've made it almost in the form of a jacket now, where you can remove these pouches, and these pouches can be easily cooled in regular freezers, fridges that are
Sure,
available.
refrigerators. Right,
Yes.
right.
And you can put them in, and you can get the body cooled even in heat summer temperatures very quickly. So I just wanted to highlight this there, and I think that's
terrific. For those workers or those employers who can afford these for their workforce, it's a lifesaver, literally a lifesaver to have those. And they were tried out in Florida in the hot houses where workers were working in solar greenhouses or hothouses for agricultural products. In the summertime, those temperatures are unbearably hot. But these cooling jackets, as they were called, which are essentially filled with gels, frozen gel packs, provided comfort for workers to allow them to work in places that would otherwise will be unbearable.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
The gel packs generally were at 0, so we found thermal shocks coming to the body, sometimes due to contact. So we designed the plus 22 because those were far more comfortable for the body.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Praveen. It was indeed, we need more of these innovations and collaborations to find out more solutions. We are about time now, so I would request Dr. Satish to wind up and give the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Supriya. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Ashok Gadgil for the wonderful talk and presentation. And the quality of the presentation is in terms of the questions that are asked, I think, after the presentation. So we can gauge from the interest and from all the questions that were thrown at Dr. Gadgil's way. I will just probably try to highlight 3 things from the talk from my perspective. So first of all, I think the heat stress is here and now. I think as a result of the climate change that we are experiencing throughout the world. And there is a lot of work, there is a lot of research that has been done historically, but some of that research, I think, is being challenged, that is being tweaked, that is being refined to address the new challenge, I think, the new normal that we are facing. And this is true, I think, as Professor Gadgil, you spoke about, I think, the heat index and extended heat index. And we also have seen that happening in the indoor thermal comfort, where Fanger's classical PMV has been modified based on the exposure that people get in tropical countries and the adaptation that they show.
Right.
So I think that is one very, very important piece. These new research that is happening in world's leading journals like Nature and Lancet and others, I think it should provide additional evidence to the policymakers, to the researchers. And I think as countries are developing new building energy codes or heat action plans and many, many things to counteract and keep people safe. So I think that's the first piece. The second piece is very, very important, and especially for the audience here and the India Cooling Coalition. You also alluded, I think, in the presentation, but definitely in the course of the Q&A, the need for innovation and the need for, I think, better kind of material innovation or other thermal innovation like slurry and other products that can be developed and designed, which it's not just this is not just limited to highlighting what the problem is, but how do we solve this problem? And I think that's a very, very important aspect of this talk, because I think it has provided us, I think, it definitely food for thought in terms of business opportunities, I think research opportunities, as well as advocacy opportunities on what needs to be done. And I think the third and final thing that I'm going to touch upon is that in the context of, I think, what India is facing, I think the situation is really urgent and almost like we are facing a climate and heat emergency. And it's very much needed that different disciplines need to come together to tackle this problem. So while I think we are looking at it from physics side, but looking at it from material science side, looking at it from health side, I think is going to be equally important, because this is a multidimensional and a very wicked problem. And we will not be able to crack this nut, I think, in time or cost effectively if I think we are all working in our silos. And I think on that piece, Dr. Gadgil, I am going to sort of like look at, I think, ways in which entities like ICC or AEEE and many other our member organizations, if there are ways to collaborate, to share the data, to share the evidence, I think, that we are gathering from India, around the world, in the US, and see, I think, how we can actually make a more concerted case for urgent action to address this emergency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure that you actually have so many people coming to pay attention to this such a critically important topic. Thank you for your convening power to focus on this topic. Great.